Thanks for joining in this session. For those of you that I have not met yet, I'm Father Ben Berinti, a missionary of the Precious Blood. I serve on our provincial council for the U.S. province, and I am currently in ministry along the coast of East Central Florida in Melbourne Beach. I've been actually serving in that's the Diocese of Orlando. I've been serving there for about 28 years now in a variety of different ministries and capacities. I started my career at St. Joseph's College in Rensselaer as a chaplain and professor, and thought that I would never leave that ministry my entire life. And I always used to say, as a young priest, the last thing I would do over my dead body would be to go and be a parish priest, let alone be a pastor. So God has struck me now. I have spent 13 years as a pastor, so and hopefully done some good things in the process of that. So anyway, let's get right to the business. So I've entitled my presentation, I Thirst, a Call to Mission from the Living Chalice on the Cross. So just a synopsis of the direction I want to lead us in today is that when you think about, that's one of the 7 last words, so I thirst, 2 words. While uttered in agony from the cross, surprisingly, they are a call to mission. And I don't think we often think about it in that kind of way. And so hopefully by the time we're finished this afternoon, we'll be able to have a deeper and a different appreciation for that. And so what I'm hoping in this session will help us to reflect upon and respond to that invitation to become living chalices poured out for a thirsting world. We easily make references to the cup, the chalice being offered at the Last Supper. So here is the moment. This is the event of Christ giving, offering his precious blood. But yet, if you really want to think about it, the real access of the actual giving of the precious blood is upon the cross. That's when all is poured out. So it's almost as if the meal table is a anticipation of, or as we heard Ed use the word earlier today, a rehearsal for what is about to happen on the cross. So that's what I hope to help us explore. So that's just by way of introduction. One of my all-time favorite writers, theologically, let alone on the Eucharist. So this is my favorite book of my entire life. I first encountered it, I think, as a junior in college at St. Joseph's College. It was part of a curriculum there. Have loved this writer and this particular book. It is a skinny little book, but it is a very potent book. So if you have never encountered Monica Helwig or this text, I would highly encourage you. It was revised a number of years ago. Helwig has been dead for a number of years now, but the book was revised, a little bit of updating, but pretty much the same. It is entitled The Eucharist and the Hunger of the World. And the main question that Helwig uses to explore the Eucharist in this particular book, she puts it this way: how is one to know at the level of personal experience what is meant in sacrament? I don't think that's the general starting point for our considerations about sacrament. It has certainly not been the starting point or the middle point, or quite frankly will be the ending point of the last 2 years of the Eucharistic revival. How is it that we can come to know the meaning of sacrament, all of the sacraments, big S, small s sacraments, but particularly the 7 sacraments, and for our purposes, the body and blood of Christ in the sacrament? How can we know that at the level of personal experience? Because if we don't know it there, then we really don't know it. It's trapped somewhere else in a book, in a brain, somewhere else. So that's the heart of where she begins. If I had $1 for every time I have shared this line, which I am sharing with you now, I would probably not be here. I would be already retired in a Swiss chalet in the Alps, because I would be a multimillionaire for every time I've shared this particular quote. But this is the heart of her reflection on the Eucharist, and it begins this way. She says, so what she's trying to do in the book is she wants to look at the Eucharist, tear off all the accretions, take off everything that has been built up over the centuries with it, ritually, theologically. Let's get back to the core of what is happening there when you take away all the accretions. And she says the simple central action, which we've heard repeatedly today from Ed this morning. If you were in Joe's session, he referred back to action. Again, I'm sure others are doing the same thing. The simple central action of the Eucharist is the sharing of food and drink. Not only eating and drinking, this is an important point of hers. It's not eating and drinking, but it is the sharing of food and drink. And then people consume it. That's the simple central action of the Eucharist. So you can put on all the other accretions you want to, but when you get back down to the center of what is happening when we are gathered there, we are sharing food and drink. So her next question is, well, what would make us want to do that? What is the simple central human experience for understanding why we want to share food and drink, why we want to eat and drink? And her answer to that is, to be human is to be hungry. Not to be hungry and thirsty is to be dead. And that is not just on a physical level. That is spiritually, emotionally. You and I know lots of people who we sit around every day sucking in air who are not alive because they no longer have any hungers or thirsts. They have no interests, no curiosities, no willingness to explore anything else in life, not willing to go beyond the circle that they occupy right now. They are in many ways dead from a lack of hunger and thirst. So the simple central human experience for understanding that action of hunger and thirst is to be human is to be hungry, not to be hungry, and thirsty is to be dead. So the Eucharistic focus, if you will, is that the bread, the body of life, responds to hunger. But yet the more crucial reality of human living, the more dangerous experience is not hunger, it is thirst. That is the more crucial reality, and we'll be exploring that a little bit more in a few moments. The more critical what's more necessary for human survival, and not only survival, but flourishing, is the satisfaction of thirst. And so much of our Eucharistic theology and Eucharistic sacramental speak is always about bread hunger, not thirst. And thirst is yet the more critical reality of human life. Thirst is more dangerous, it is more life-threatening. And so I believe, to start off at the beginning here, not for the Church in the United States, but for us in our own little corners of it, the challenge for renewal or revival for the Eucharist is somehow to root all of our spirituality, all of our theology, all of our liturgical practice regarding the blood of Christ has to be rooted in the human experience of thirst. I think that's where we can gain real traction. So we're a long way off from can we get people to drink from the chalice? But even to begin to consider that, one has to somehow be led to be in touch more with what are one's thirsts, because then when I am dying of thirst, I want to grab at something that's going to respond to that thirst. And it's not a piece of bread transformed to the body of Christ, it's the chalice that contains drink. So all of this Eucharistic revival, wherever we are, and hopefully as we go forth from here, I think the way that we will advance everything that we're sharing here is that we have to keep rooting the blood of Christ in the human experience of thirst in some way, shape, or form. So what I have to do then, just a quick overview of our session, and my feeling is already I will probably begin speeding up my pace as I continue moving along. I always talk about my manner of presentation comes from my Italian heritage, and it's associated with Italian eating and drinking. The greatest embarrassment for an Italian is never to have enough of anything, which means you have 10 times more than you actually need. So you don't have 2 desserts, you have 4. There's 5 entrees, there's 6 vegetables, just in case somebody runs a little short. That's how I present. I always have more than anyone is going to be able to consume at any one setting, but I will do my best to try to share at least the most of what I have with you. So first we're going to take a look at the power of thirst, a deeply human experience. Then we'll take a look at that uttering from Christ on the cross, I thirst, which I'm going to help us try to understand. It is really the heart of the Paschal mystery. Then we'll take a look at Christ on the cross as the living chalice poured out for us. And then finally, taking a look at our call to mission. We are now imitating Christ on the cross as a living chalice. You and I are called to mission, which is pouring out for a thirsting world. So that's an overview of where I hope to take us. So let's talk a little bit about the power of thirst. Water, as we know, is essential for life. The prevention of dehydration, because without drink, humans can only survive about 3 days. You can go a lot longer without eating, but not without drinking. 3 days tops, no matter your age, your health, doesn't matter. That's a great sort of equalizer. Let me just share something, a little bit of a quick science of thirst. Again, because the whole purpose here is to root us in the human experience of thirst. And then we can start sacramentalizing and theologizing and spiritualizing. So a guy by the name of Dr. Goodman, interesting enough, says this, that thirst is really a defense mechanism. In other words, this is your body's way of letting you know that your fluid levels are imbalanced. Because our body is made up of many tiny cells. Each cell needs a balanced amount of fluid, both inside and outside, to function properly. When there is less fluid outside of the cells than inside, fluid is drawn out from each cell to compensate. And he compares that to the way that a dry sponge soaks up water. The resulting lack of fluid diminishes your cell's ability to perform essential functions. So when your cells don't function normally, your overall body function starts to decline. Luckily, drinking fluid replenishes your cells and they start functioning normally again. That's the human experience of thirst. I'm not ready to extrapolate to thirsting for the blood of Christ yet, but root where we're going in that reality. What happens when we are not receiving the thirst that our bodies are requiring? And remember, when we consume Eucharist, it becomes cellular activity. This is becoming a part. This is not imagination. It's not a metaphor any longer. This is a reality of how the body is functioning, including when we are consuming the bread transformed into the body, the blood transformed into the blood of Christ. Something is happening to us at a cellular level when we share in Eucharist. It's not just something of the head and something of a pietistic practice. So thirst is our first and primary and primal physical and social need. Thirst is also a social need, a personal human need that requires action to be taken. So you can see immediately why we've been already circling around all this business about in the Second Vatican Council talking about Eucharist is action, because hunger and thirst, they don't demand a greeting card. They don't demand, let's do a litany. They don't demand, let's kneel down and whatever. They demand action. Otherwise, we die. So they are a personal human need, thirst that requires action to be taken. And so thirst, Hellwood would say, like hunger, she uses a lot of large words. She says thirst is elemental. It is constricting. In other words, the more thirsty you become, the more constricted your life becomes. It is painful. It is an urgent need. It faces us clearly with our insufficiency and our dependence. Hunger and thirst are brutalizing. Brutalizing not just the body, but the soul, spirit, everything else about us. Thirst is life-threatening. So thirst is our first and primary need. Just think of the image, and many of you have done this for people you've cared for, maybe even dying parents and so forth. Think about the dying person, the hospice person, and you're feeding him the ice chips. Just those little fragments of something to satisfy a depth of thirst that is clearly before your eyes, brutalizing, urgent. Just touching their lips with a little bit of a wet sponge or something like that. So thirst at every level always seeks to be quenched, seeks to be slaked and satisfied. You can never still or silence thirst. You can't quiet it. It has its own, it has a life of its own. It can never be stilled or silenced. Our life literally depends upon the satisfaction of thirst. And so, therefore, what happens is, for us, thirst, let me just back up for a moment, thirst becomes a powerful metaphor. And as Joe and others would know, as writers, metaphors are not little tiny cute things that writers put out for people. Metaphors are the depth of how we truly come to understand truth. And therefore, that's why sacramental life is a life of metaphor. So, thirst becomes a powerful sacramental symbol and action because I believe, and I'd like to suggest to you, that the most potent and most engaging sacramental symbols are always grounded in embodiment. Even ritually, let me get off the track for just a moment here, but even ritually, we observe this ritually in the church. We have all kinds of rituals, and many were changed when the Roman Missal was revised. And you can see from practice which ones have caught on and which ones have not. And then, of course, the ones that people make up that are nowhere to be found anywhere. I mean, I'm looking out there presiding, I'm thinking like, oh my God, what are all these gyrations that people are going through? Where did this come from? Then I see social media, and then I understand certain aspects of social media where these things come from. But what I want to say is that the things that are the metaphors, the sacrament activity that isn't really embodied, like gets into your skin, we don't pay attention to. It never clicks. It never works. So if you want something to really become, if we want thirst and the blood of Christ to become really a part of our lives, of someone's life, then it has to be grounded in embodiment. And that's why we keep speaking about, the blood of Christ crying out on the streets of Chicago or St. Louis or in Bosnia or, visiting dying sisters in the retirement home or whatever it happens to be. The most powerful, and those sacramental realities, rituals, practices that are not well grounded in the body, they go by the wayside. Nobody pays any attention to them anymore. So I want to take a quick little diversion that will, somewhat of a diversion, but it will connect us together. And in this way, I'd like to demonstrate from a scriptural standpoint what I was just talking about, the power of sacramental and embodiment. And I want to use, obviously, the Samaritan woman at the well. Remember this about the narrative. Both Jesus and the Samaritan woman share in common. So remember, the whole narrative only begins because they have one thing in common. And it's not you're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan. We already know that's not working. The one thing that they have in common is the human experience of thirsting and drinking. That's what they share. And it is Jesus is the one who first says, I thirst. So we're going to circle back to this first statement of I thirst when he's on the cross. But he's already been saying this many times before, one of them prominently here at the time of the Samaritan woman. But both of these people, what connects them, what draws them together, and then what opens up more than dropping a bucket into a well, is the fact that it is something grounded in the bodily desire for satisfaction of thirst. The difference lies in that for Jesus, this human experience now is going to serve a broader experience. It's going to try to reach into something deeper than just simple physical human thirst. It is going to serve as a medium for conveying a reality, a spiritual reality that's much deeper. And that's why they go through the quite humorous conversation that they have at the beginning of their dialogue. You don't even have a bucket. You don't have this. You don't have that. Well, you don't do this and you don't do that. All this skirting around the issue until we finally get to the truth of the matter. Jesus, for her, has to keep peeling back layers to get to what the real thirst is. But she does it by also challenging him in what he has to say and whether it makes any sense or not. How embodied is his desire for thirst? So Jesus' thirst and that of the Samaritan woman are inseparably linked. And I think, jumping ahead a bit, this is the heart of what will keep propelling us to deepen our living of the spirituality of the blood of Christ. We have to keep finding common ground of thirst with others so that our thirst, others' thirst, become inseparable. And from that, we then can propose that the blood of Christ provides satisfaction. Perfect model here in the Samaritan woman. So let me return for a moment to Jesus' cry of thirst on the cross. I thirst, John 19:28. When Jesus cries out, the evangelist John is presenting to us in the manner of what I was just saying a little bit earlier about the deepest metaphors are embodied. This is what John is doing. It's a multi-layered cry. It is a multifaceted, multivalent reality that Jesus is trying to present through the human experience of thirst. And this is what John is trying to do there. There's much more going on than I'm dying, I'm thirsty. Stick a sponge in my mouth. It is rooted in a desperate and brutalizing human experience of thirst before dying. Jesus is now the hospice patient. Jesus' mother is now your fellow sister, your mother, your father, who you're feeding ice chips to. In this moment, the cry for thirst is rooted in something incredibly human and brutalizing, dehumanizing. And that is the experience of thirst before dying. But at the same time, Jesus is groaning for something greater. He's groaning for something deeper. He's groaning for something beyond physical thirst here. That doesn't remove his cry from the reality of I am literally dying of thirst. See, because that's what I think we often want to do in our spirituality, our theologizing, our liturgizing, and everything else is, oh yeah, there's a human experience here, but let's move on from that. Let's go on to the more theological, the deeper, the broader, the more devotional meaning. And what we become is then we become untethered from human experience. And fundamentally, for me, it's maybe a way oversimplification, but I'll say it anyway. This is part of the drift away from church. The less you become rooted in the real human experiences of people and try to connect sacraments to that, why would I bother? Why would I bother? I'll go look for somebody else who can somehow speak to what my human experience is and perhaps propose something. Now, we sit back in our ivory tower and say, but they're proposing things that are not good for you. Well, start proposing something in a way that responds to people's human hungers and thirsts, and then maybe there will be a true Eucharistic revival. So let's take a look now at Jesus' cry of thirst, the heart of the Paschal mystery. So we have Jesus on the cross, and he is literally dying of thirst. All right, there's no question about that. They are the two shortest words that Jesus utters on the cross. And when you look at Jesus hanging on the cross, the same man who walked on water, calmed stormy water, changed water into wine, now is the man who is dying of thirst, lack of water. Jesus' cry, I think, in many ways captures the whole heart of the divine human pathos of the Passion. And it can be said to be really the very heart of the Paschal mystery. It is the shortest utterance of Jesus, and yet it bears an incredible depth to it. Those echoes, so Jesus proclaiming, I thirst on the cross, echoes many thirsts throughout Scripture. So here he is, literally dying of thirst, And John gives us that statement. But immediately, in those two words, we are suddenly connected with a breadth of thirst, scripturally. Jesus' cry captures the many reverberations of thirst throughout sacred Scripture. John's I thirst is rooted in other experiences of thirst in Scripture. Because in many ways, if you think about it, a lot of different angles to approach the Scriptures, but perhaps think about it this way. All of biblical history, all of, for that matter, human history, is really a chronicle of thirst. Just think about that. All of human history could be retold from the lens of being a chronicle of people dying of thirst at all sort of levels of who they are. So we have, and I had some of them listed, but you can search them for yourselves, from the patriarchs to the Israelites in the desert, a whole plethora of Scripture. So just remember this, that as Jesus speaks these words and John gives them to us, this is opening up a whole salvation history of us dipping into thirst all over the place. So again, later on for us, as we try to connect the experience of human thirst with the blood of Christ in our spirituality, we have a whole treasure trove of places of other human experiences, wandering in a desert, being a nomadic people. The patriarchs were nomadic well diggers, for lack of a better expression. This is what their life was before they decided to start farming. They had to dig wells first before they could start raising animals. The prophets were always using images. God's mercy was seen as this overflowing water. Remember all the water flowing out of the temple, first 3 feet, then 6 feet, then 9 feet, then you can't even swim in it, and everything is growing in its path. So there's much depth of Scripture that we can open up to help us deepen our own understanding. So all encounters with God, in many ways, are, first of all, every encounter with God, whether it's a patriarch or whether it's you and I sitting in this room right now, all experiences, encounters with God are brought about by human experience. I think we take that maybe for granted, and maybe it's too simple to even think about. No one encounters God. God doesn't approach anybody except because there is some human experience that needs to be attended to. God doesn't approach us for theological purposes. He doesn't approach us for sacramental purposes or devotional purposes or philosophical purposes. You're a human being. You have something that needs to be tended to, so I think I will. Let's have an encounter. Let's meet up. And it is this encounter and consequences of thirst that often draws God into relationship with people. And here we are, meeting Jesus on the cross, experience in that moment a whole gamut of other experiences in his dying moments, all kinds of emotions. And that is what provides common ground for our encounters with Jesus and God. Here is the Christ on the cross, pouring out body and blood. We find ourselves in similar situations of our own making, great, small, made by others. This is the meeting point. That's why we often refer, Schreiter was big on that, probably stole it from somebody else, but the cross is the axis mundi. This is where you plant the stake and everything else whirls around it. T.S. Eliot had great vision of that. This is the axis around which the entire world turns. That's what the cross becomes for us. Why? Because that's a meeting place. And that is the meeting place for us to draw others in, as Joe said in his presentation a little bit earlier today, in that pool of blood that is gathered at the foot of the cross. There isn't one human being who has not had an experience that won't allow them to swim in that blood. That's not Joe's, that's mine. That's the meeting point. So that leads me to suggest, so I talked about echoes in Scripture. Let me just skip over these. That leads me now for us to reflect a little bit about Christ again on the cross, opening up that a little bit more, but the image and the metaphor and the sacramental symbol of Christ as a living cup, a living chalice. So the first thing that these near final words on the cross do for us is they immediately connect us with all of Jesus' references to and all of his speaking about the cup. And not just at the last table. There were many other times. Look at all the monologues, I should say, in John's gospel about the cup. So in this moment, him saying, "I thirst," connects us with all of Jesus' reference to and speaking about the cup. Because it is the cup, the chalice, that holds the content for the quenching of thirst. That's why we're drawn to the cup. Because in it contains the content for the slaking of thirst. So when we think about and have that image of Christ on the cross, and we hear those words reverberating, "I thirst," it should take us to other places, even all the way back, for example, to the Samaritan woman. Jesus didn't thirst for the first time on the cross. One could say that his entire ministry was motivated by being someone who was willing to respond to people's thirst. That's the one thing we often think about. There's certainly a culmination of Jesus' life and ministry at the supper table, the Passover meal. But that's all he was doing his entire life, was giving body and blood. Day after day, week after week. This isn't like the first time. This might be a crescendo of that, and then it becomes even more of a peak on the cross. But so as he utters these words about "I thirst" on the cross, it's connecting us with all of the different ways that he mentions cup. The metaphors of thirst now flips into, and that's what I want to move us in what time we have remaining, is we've tried to build on reflecting on the nature of thirst. But now, in this moment, when Jesus claims "I thirst," it flips sort of the metaphor from the desire of thirst, the need for satisfaction, to the satisfaction. Jesus now becomes the living cup. So we're moving from thinking about thirst, now let's think about drinking. And here is Christ, the living chalice on the cross, pouring out for us. There are lots of other references, again, in the New Testament where Jesus is using cup language. Matthew 20, "Are you able to drink the cup?" Matthew 26, "Drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of my covenant." Luke 22, "Father, if you're willing, can you take this thing away from me? I don't even want to face my own thirst at the moment right now." I mean, how many of us can be able to connect with that moment in our own lives, or we're walking and accompanying people like, I see it. Oh, I know what it is. And I already have an idea what it's going to taste like. And so therefore, I'm not in it. John 7, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me." John 18, Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back. Am I not to drink the cup that is being offered to me?" So this moment connects us with all of those. And it is a cup both of sorrow and it is a cup of blessing. The final passing over, the final Passover of Christ on the cross, he is now in this moment drinking the bitterness of the suffering and death that he will endure in his mission to, as he says many times in John's gospel, to lay down his life for his own. This is the moment of laying down his life for his own in obedience to the Father. And so one of the things that John does for us, and the late Donald Sr. helps us to understand here, in writing about this particular passage, Sr. said, "This moment, I thirst, in John's gospel portrayal, was the driving force of Jesus' mission. Therefore, the cry of thirst that echoes over Golgotha is no longer a cry of torment." Remember, this is, Senior says here, that's what the onlookers are thinking. Oh, he's in such pain. He's calling out for Elijah. He's doing this. He's doing that. It is no longer a cry of torment, but it is a final act of commitment. Jesus thirsts for God, and he thirsts out of love for his own in the world. So everybody else misunderstands. This is no longer in this moment a cry for the satisfaction of dying human thirst. This is a moment of communion with Father and with all else and everyone else and anyone else from that point forward to the end of time who is going to hunger and thirst. John knows what he's doing here in this particular moment. So Jesus on the cross, I thirst, then becomes now the living cup, the living chalice. And as John will tell us, pouring out body, blood, and finally blood and water. The life-redeeming blood is now the vessel of life. It's the vessel of grace. It's the vessel of hope, love, living water, lifeblood for a thirsty world. In that particular moment, this is Jesus's perhaps one of his most profound, and I think we think there's many theologies and many spiritualities of certainly looking at the cross, but to look at it perhaps through the lens, this is perhaps Jesus's greatest act of commitment. I think to introduce that word, that reality into what is going on. Oh, dying for my sins, all the low-hanging fruit that we pick about the cross. This is an act of commitment that is made in the only way that true acts of commitment can be made, and that is out of love. Unbounded love. So it is no longer, I thirst, a cry of torment. And that's where I'd like to shift us now in our closing moments. I believe this is our call to mission. So I thirst connects us with the human reality of our own and others' thirst. Physical, spiritual, emotional, social, every level of what it means to be a human person and to live in human communities. Christ then presents his blood as satisfaction. I am the living container of what pours out from me is the source of satisfaction. And if you don't participate in it, you die. I was thinking as Joe was presenting a little while ago, when I was the co-pastor or pastor of two different parishes a year and a half ago, coming up on almost 2 years ago, we began to introduce the blood of Christ there because it had not been at all on the radar of that particular parish. So it was a very slow and difficult process. Lots of challenges, practical challenges. Of course, the most important why one cannot offer the blood of Christ as Eucharist is we don't have enough Eucharistic ministers. All right, that's a strategy. That's not a problem. So anyway, we had many different things. So I was trying to share different, we were preaching about it. I was putting different reflections in the bulletin about it, building up to when we were going to start, which we then started, I forget when the occasion was, but so all these different kind of things. And I remember a parishioner coming to me and saying, thank God they were, but they said, I've been reading all this stuff. So, well, that's at least a good start. You might not like it, but you're reading it. I've been reading all this stuff, and I've been hearing what you've been saying, and you make it sound like we're doing something wrong if we don't share from the chalice. I said, yeah, that's about it. Yes, you are an incredibly insightful and perceptive person. It's like you're making me feel like I'm doing something wrong. Yes, you are. Now, we have more florid language to describe why that isn't really the thing to do, the texts that say it's a fuller expression and all that kind of stuff. So I did feel good, at least for one person. All of that catechesis on sharing the blood of Christ worked because they felt they were doing something wrong and they wanted to do something right. So that was the other part. So, well, now that you think you're doing something wrong, do you want to do something right? So start going. So anyway, our call to mission. It is no longer a cry of desperation, I thirst for the cross, but it is a call and an invitation to mission, because it is Christ, the living chalice, that is being poured out. Like Christ and the Samaritan woman at the well, who says, Jesus says, give me a drink, I thirst. Look at it this way. Not only in that experience, that encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, but you could transpose this on every encounter Christ had or continues to have with any of us or other people today, is the cry of I thirst got the whole thing started. There would have been no further conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman, or for that matter, anyone else, or any further encounters. I thirst is what got the whole thing started. And that is our mission. As we reflected early on in the presentation, thirst requires, thirst demands action to be taken. Thirst must be satisfied. There's no equivocating about it. It must be satisfied. It has to be responded to, for good or for ill. It is a potent force, and it encompasses all dimensions of the human person. We can talk about thirst at every level of the human person: physical thirst, emotional thirst, psychological thirst, relational thirst, spiritual thirst. Here in a non-sacramental way, let me just quickly illustrate what I'm trying to say. Thirst is so desperate in the human person, it must be satisfied. And people will choose to do many, many things to somehow satisfy what they perceive as a thirst, even if it becomes later on detrimental to them. But it has to be satisfied. So you look at the person and you say to yourself, oh my God, why do they keep going from one busted relationship to another busted relationship to another busted relationship? Like, is this their modus operandi? Well, at some level, the thirst for companionship, for love, for whatever it is so deep and so profound and has to be satisfied that sometimes you grab at whatever is the nearest, quickest thing that you think might just be an ice chip, to use that metaphor, to my tongue. Even though in the end, this is what tells us how deep hungers and thirsts really are in human persons. And yet too often, many tend to avoid and to ignore the deepest thirst, the deepest emptiness of their lives, because it's too painful to go there. It's too painful to go there. It's too painful to go into the depths. It's too painful for many people to simply be with themselves for any period of time. So we do what we do best. We fill ourselves with distractions. That's what the Samaritan woman, that's what she first was spilling out after the call for I thirst. Well, you people worship here, we worship there. You don't have a bucket, you don't have this, you know. She tries to go to the theological and to everything else, and then Jesus just, look, I'm thirsty, lady, And really what I have to offer you is a little bit more than what's going to be in that bucket. We fill ourselves with distractions that defend us from emptiness. And the security of our lives is based on so many variables that can crumble at any moment. And we all know that. Life is just moving along. There's a doctor in my parish. He's a well-known cancer doctor in the area. He's probably in his early 70s, still working, great guy, great family. Life is moving along, serving his patients, and then 2 weeks ago he gets diagnosed with esophageal cancer. Okay. It doesn't take long for life to change direction and crumble. Jesus' ability to cry out, I thirst, tells us that, first of all, he was in touch at a very profound level with his own emptiness. Even, that's a way of looking at the cry, at least as some authors talk of it, in Gethsemane. On one level, like, let this cup pass, is a cry of torment, it's a cry of avoidance, it's a cry of something else. But in many ways, Jesus at least said it. Why? Because he was in touch with, in that moment, the depth of his own emptiness. And that allowed him to say, I thirst, to become vulnerable in that moment to the Father, here to become vulnerable to anybody who was hanging around the foot of the cross. At a very profound level, he was in touch with his own emptiness as the living chalice, now nearly completely poured out. And so to share in and drink from the living cup, the blood of the Lamb of God slain, is to be with him on the cross, staring into the cup of suffering and blessing that we are offered, and to then take action. That is mission. If you get tired of hearing the word mission, change it for 2 more words. Oh, what is all this talk about mission today? It's like, take action. Get up, take action. That's what mission is, action. Take action on behalf of others who are thirsting. Many of you might already know this, but St. Teresa of Calcutta, at the age of 33 is when she had her mystical experience encounter with Christ, in which he revealed to her personally something of the mystery of his own thirst. And so in every house of the Sisters, Missionaries of Charity, there are the words, "I thirst," next to the crucifix. This was the experience she had, of which would become a singular, so her whole ministry was about being a singular witness to the mystery of Christ thirsting, this one profound moment. And to this day, every house of the Missionaries of Charity throughout the world, next to the crucifix, is this simple, or in every chapel, one will find written on the wall, written, "I thirst." The words are a reminder that all are called in mission to love the one who loved us first, and then to slake the thirst, take action for the thirst of those for whom Jesus poured out his blood on the cross. And so on the cross, the living chalice, that's where the thirst of Christ meets our thirst, and where we draw the thirst of others whom we minister to. That's where the living chalice's thirst meets our thirst in a reciprocal relationship. Teresa of Calcutta put it this way: "I thirst" is something much deeper than Jesus just saying, "I love you." Until you know deep inside that Jesus thirsts for you, you can't begin to know who he wants to be for you, or who he wants you to be for him. That's a reciprocal relationship. So the cry of Christ from the cross and about thirst is not about litmus tests and worthy or unworthy, or this is going to fix me, or something else. I think the most profound, and if we can work with the reality of responding to thirst and put our liturgical theology, our Eucharistic theology and reality into that kind of language about thirsting, then it might make sense to come and participate in an event that does try to bring satisfaction for hunger and thirst, what we call the Mass and Eucharist, where you're taking and eating, taking and drinking. I just preached that a couple of weeks ago. Jesus did not say, "Come and look, come and kneel, come and bow, come and gyrate, come and this, come and that, come and look, take and eat, take and drink." So if you're not taking and eating and taking and drinking, yep, you're doing something wrong. We're back to that again. But that whole sense of it's not us needing to be ready in some way, shape, or form to then share in this satisfaction of thirst as Christ is offering. He has already long been thirsting for us. And I think if we can somehow share that with people and get beyond, well, you got to do this first, or you got to be fixed first, or you have to go through these trainings, and you have to do that. Just start at the simple, basic level of God's self is thirsting. It's the old Francis Thompson, Hound of Heaven. It's the God who's chasing you, not you chasing God. So to know deep inside that Jesus thirsts for you, you can't even begin to know who he wants to be for you, or who he wants you to be for him. It's that reciprocal relationship continues because in us then offering a drink to Jesus in disguise, in all the people that we meet, our thirst is actually being quenched. To be people of the blood of Christ and to pour out, as now we are the living chalices in mission, in the pouring out and the trying to help some way to satisfy thirst of others, our thirsts are also being quenched, because it's the Lord who is acting here, not you or me or somebody else. Our thirst is quenched, but at the same time, here's the flip side of it, every time we do this in mission, our thirst is also being intensified. There's no moment of complete satisfaction. The more we pour out and the more we are quenching, and we're quenching our thirst, it intensifies thirst and should drive us even more into mission. And so, as we stare into and we drink of the precious blood, I propose that we need to remain rooted in human experience. And that is why Eucharistic prayer for various occasions, 3 and 4th, are the prayers I usually use at a Mass 90% of the time. If you love Eucharistic prayer, don't ever come to one of my liturgies. Number 1. Not even at Christmas nor Easter. The only time I'm stuck with it is Holy Thursday, because that's the only, you're not allowed to use anything else. Because right in those prayers, they are the remnant of words from the actual Second Vatican Council's Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy. The hopes and dream, the grief and pain are the grief and pain and joys and hopes of the world. We go forward with people along the way of Christ. Powerful language about mission there that you cannot find in any other Eucharistic prayer. So that's my picadillo. Those are my preferences. So take a look at those, especially after the narrative words. They're really, really potent. They're the only Eucharistic prayer I think that really speaks to mission directly. And it's very clear. Peace, justice, be witnesses to hope and freedom and all these other kinds of things. Very much rooted there. Those prayers give voice to that call. Grant that all the faithful of the church, looking to the signs of times by the light of faith, may faithfully devote themselves to the service of the gospel. Keep us attentive to the needs of all, that sharing their grief and pain, their joy and hope. Open our eyes to the needs of our brothers and sisters. Inspire in us words and actions to comfort those who labor and are burdened. There's no other. The ones for reconciliation have their own beauty and a different kind of a mission in them. But these are the only two out of the plethora of, and many people in our churches will never even know these exist, let alone ever hear them. So by way of conclusion then, the Johannine spirituality, even though we always think and experience Johannine spirituality in scripture reading, is incredibly elevated, to say the least. His spirituality never does away with the real life. So when Jesus, he has him saying, "I thirst" on the cross, he is dying of thirst. That's a real human experience. But then he tries to see the deeper sense, the depth dimension of the events of life. And that is, to me, this is what ministry is all about. It's about helping people see the depth dimension of life. And that's why in our cultures it is incredibly challenging, because people don't want to face the depth of life. It's easier to live on the surface of life, and even then, a very, very minimal surface of life. So, just by way of conclusion, I want to share a favorite poet of mine, Mary Oliver, many really wonderful things there. She had a poem, title of a collection of poetry called Thirst. Another morning and I wake with thirst for the goodness I do not have. I walk out to the pond, and all the way God has given us such beautiful lessons. Oh Lord, I was never a quick scholar, but I sulked and I hunched over my books past the hour and the bell. Grant me in your mercy a little more time. Love for the earth, love for you, are having such a long conversation in my heart. Who knows what will finally happen or where I will be sent? Yet already I have given a great many things away, expecting to be told to pack nothing except the prayers which, with this thirst, I am slowly learning. Jesus' unquenched thirst on the cross brings us to him, the living chalice of water and blood, and therefore we and anyone else who suffers is never alone. This is the great promise. And then it is our responsibility to make sure, this is why we accompany people. You know, there's a great movement in many hospitals and places called No One Dies Alone. You know, you don't have any family, but there are these movements in places where somebody, just a random person, is part of No One Dies Alone. They call you and you come and sit with somebody you never met in your life so that they don't die alone. This is our role in accompaniment, is no one is ever alone, no matter what their story happens to be. And so until the end of time, Jesus is going to continue to cry out, "I thirst." And he becomes the companion of every thirst, every emptiness there is. Recall what Don Sr. Wrote about. The Johannine spirituality does not do away with the real life. It just deepens the moments of real life. And so I believe that Eucharistic spirituality and practice have to remain rooted in real life, in the human experience and the wide-ranging experience of thirst and hunger. So I believe this is the challenge I'd like to lay out for us. Can we hear those words? Can you reflect on and hear those words, "I thirst," and first allow them to become your own? Just allow them to, before you think about anybody else's thirst and going out there to be in mission to anybody, Can you allow those words to reverberate in your own heart and soul? Allow them to become our own words. I thirst. I think this is why there's such a great disconnect in preaching. People are preaching, they're not connecting with anybody's thirst, and one of the reasons is because they won't talk about their own. So you don't put it out there, you don't have no way of connecting to anybody. And then the next piece would be, will our, corporately, as congregations, as people devoted to the blood of Christ, will our or my cries of thirst meet and then take flesh in the way I respond to the cries of thirst from those in my life? Cries that are often suffocated, but which have to be quenched. Thank you. And a final commercial. I did write a little reflection on aspects of the blood of Christ. It's called Are You Willing to Drink? Cups of the Covenant from Passover to Eucharist. And just a quick, what I did in there was the first part of it is a reflection on the 4 cups that are shared during the Passover meal and what those were represent and what they might say to us. And then I focused on the sharing of the cup in Luke's version of the Last Supper and what that might say to us. But thank you very much, everyone.